All right, so I believe this is where we left off. This is the website list. I've been styling it just a little bit more, perhaps adding some drop downs on the right hand side, and just giving it a little more nicer look and feel, please. And it's responsive, so this changes here to this drop down when it becomes small. Also notice that the two last columns disappear when it becomes too small. The other part that we've worked on is page list. I've been styling it a little bit. Looks on this left-hand side of pages. Presumably you can create new pages, and the pages are listed on the left-hand side. Oops, okay, gotta fix that. When it becomes too small, it disappears, and you just get the left-hand side, right? And you have the drop down. All the links that you had before would be listed under here. Okay. All right. So somebody gives us this, and they want us to start making it into an Angular application. And I believe we still have the login pages as well under, let's see, under user. So I already moved them into their own directories of user or widgets or websites or pages, right? And so to reach login, it would be something like user/login. And that's our login page. Register is there as well. Register. And profile is here as well. Right? So that's it. So let's convert these all into an Angular application. All right? And so what we're going to do is that we're going to create an entry point, an HTML page, an index that's going to play the role of our container, overall container for the application, our entry point. We'll need some of the styling and libraries that we have on all our pages. We're going to copy them in here because we're going to be removing it from all of them, right? So let's copy it from, let's say, website list, which is fairly mature. We're going to copy a couple things from here. We'll copy the links for the Bootstrap, our style. Here's jQuery. Also jQuery's JavaScript. We're going to copy that as well. Some of the meta tags. Let's copy all these things and let's put them inside our index page. Okay. Also, instead of using the this CDN locally, just for convenience purposes, I'm going to point to a local instance of my Bootstrap library so that it makes it easier to work with my IDE, right? So let's see what we have. CSS. Do we have Bootstrap in here? There it is. Bootstrap min. There it is. And these, I presume these are my styles under here. Yes, this should be very good. So this is index. Oh wait, which CSS is that? Oh, it must be this CSS, and not my styles. These are my styles down here. So this should be not go up, just stay in the same CSS, the same directory I'm in, right? But Bootstrap, I'm going to use the Bootstrap that I'm going to use it for the entire website, right? For the entire assignment, set of assignments. So let's see. Let's do a hello world in the index page. Make sure that we're there. And we can navigate there. So that should be right here, index.html. And indeed, we're in hello, right? Let's make this into an Angular application. And we'll do that by loading the Angular library, right? And I believe I downloaded it, installed it locally under my JavaScript directory off of my public directory. So let's navigate there. Let's navigate. I'm going to do it right here, script. And that's found. Go up one. I believe we're going to go up one more. It went up too far, I guess. JS. Let's see what we have there. There it is, Angular. So I loaded Angular. I can now start thinking about declaring my Angular application. Let's declare my Angular application, ng-app, and the name that we suggested here is to use web app maker. If I load my index page and look at my console, and let's put this on the right hand side, and I refresh the page, notice that it complains, right? There's an exception there, and it's kind of Angular loaded, right? Angular is there, the library at least, and it says I'm looking for a module called web app maker, right? That's I'm trying to bind and load the module for this application. It's not finding it. It's not declared anywhere, right? So right away we see that these attributes actually have codes associated with them, right? It's basically going to try and load that and find that module that someone else declared, right? So let's declare that module. Let's declare that module, and we'll do it in a separate file, in our app.js file, like this, like the assignment suggests. We don't have the app.js file, so let's create it. And there it is, app.js. And in here, we're going to declare our application. And like all JavaScript files for this course, we're all going to put always our JavaScript file inside of an iffy a statement, right? This is an immediately invoked function expression. So this is the function expression, right? And it's immediately invoked, okay? So all our code is here shielded. Well, we're shielding the rest of the application from us. We don't want to litter the rest of the application with anything that we might declare here, unless we explicitly want to. We want to expose, right? We want to be able to deliberately expose what we want others to be access from us, but not just by littering the namespace, right? We want to make sure that we have a control over what is shared, okay? And here we're going to declare a module. That module we declared earlier, right? We're looking up for, right? It's a module. We called it, I believe, we called it web app maker. Did we? A web app maker, I believe we called it. There it is. So what is this Angular, right? So that's a variable. Who declared that variable? That variable was declared by when we loaded the Angular library. This Angular library declares that one variable Angular, right? It declares it in global space, right? That's why here we can see it, right? We see Angular actually doing what we just said not to do, right? I mean, if you Google, and I guess you could take the luxury of littering the namespace, especially if something's so popular as Angular. When you write a library that is as popular as Angular, go ahead, declare it in global space so that nobody will begrudge you. Same thing with jQuery. jQuery also declares its library in a global variable. A lot of these libraries, right, just because it becomes so so common and so popular, they want to make it easy for you to access them. So there it is. We have Angular, and this Angular object has this module function that allows us to declare modules that allow us to break up applications into these smaller pieces. And be able to even share with other folks, right? If we declare a module, somebody else could load our module. Right now, we're not going to load anything. We're just going to declare an empty dependency. This is declaring any dependencies we might have with other modules. We don't have any dependencies just yet. Okay. If we reload the page, it's no longer complaining, right? It doesn't complain anymore. So there we go. We have the simplest Angular application. So simple it doesn't do anything. Let's start off by implementing some of the navigational aspects, right? That when I first come along and I visit the index page, I like to see the login page. That's the very first thing that I want to see. Also remember that if I don't provide the index page, by default, the server will give me the index page, right? So if I reload this, notice that even if I don't provide index page, I am at the index page. Yes, right? It's as if it's as if it were be there. All right, so so let's load that other library that allows us to do navigation, because we want to get rid of the hard-coded links, right? That literally refer to other pages, right? Instead, we want to go through this single. We want to create single pages application instead. So to do that, we're going to need another library, right? It's the routing library, which is I downloaded it, and it's right next. Well, it should be. Let's see. I hope so. I hope it's there. No. Oh, there it is. Angular-route.js, right? It's right by the same JS directory where Angular is. There it is. Now that I do that, I want to load it as a dependency to my application that I'm building, right? So that I can access anything that's declared in that other module. I want to be able to access it. Okay. So to do that, we can declare ng-route as a dependency. So that's the name, just like we named our module Web App Maker. The ng-route. This library declares its own library, just like this module, and it names it with that name, ng-route, right? And it follows that naming convention. They all start with ng, right? Just to give an idea, whoever's loading this, that it is an Angular module. Okay, so if we reload, everything's good, right? It loaded it. So now everything that's declared in there is now accessible within our Web App Maker scope. Okay, this is equivalent to doing an import, right, or an include, right, in some other languages, right, in a Java an import or C# or C++ include. Right, so now those libraries are accessible in my namespace. All right, great. So that allows us to bring aboard a lot of new features, which we're going to be using in another JavaScript, which we're going to call config. Right, config. In config, we're going to again, everything is going to be declared in an IIFE, right? So don't do anything outside of an IIFE until you become famous like Angular or jQuery. Then go ahead and declare something global space. So here, we're going to grab that module we just declared 2 seconds ago. We're going to grab the module, the Web App Maker. Okay. Notice this is now a read operation, right? If it's one argument, okay, you're reading the module so that you can keep doing some things to it. Okay. Here, instead, we are declaring it, right, and any dependencies of the module. Right. So the syntax is a little bit different. Okay. Here we are reading it. It's declared. Who knows that it's declared? Angular knows that it's declared. Right. Angular knows that we've declared that module. It's a namespace, basically. It's like a package, right? And what do we want to do? We want to configure it, right? So we do a .config. So all these functions are following a pattern, a design pattern that what happens here is that this object, this instance, this object instance, is being returned by this function, the .module. .module, when you call it, the very last thing that that function does, it returns the instance of the object, of the parent object. Okay, that means that when you call it again, right, it's as if you are calling Angular.config. You see that, right? And it's a design pattern that is very, very common in JavaScript, right? That allows you to do these chainings, you know, to just chain lots and lots of functions one after another, right? Apply to the original object. Make sense? It's very, very convenient. We're going to be using that quite often. Here's one of the first examples. But when we look at jQuery, same thing. jQuery follows also that same pattern. All right, so we're calling config on Angular, right? And the config function takes as argument a function. a function that you can declare right here, right? And you can do the coding right here. I find this syntax disturbing of using functions declared inside of function calls, but you will find that a lot in JavaScript. Okay. One of the reasons that you find that is that notice that the function has no name, right? It's an anonymous function, and again, always trying to not litter the namespace. If you need this function just here, right? Why even bother giving it a name, right? Why are you going to litter the namespace? But we don't have that problem, right? Of littering the namespace because we are declaring everything local, right? Nobody else is going to see this function, right? So why even bother doing this, right? So instead, I'm going to take this out of here, and I'm going to create an honest-to-God function, right? And so I'll do I'll say configuration, right? I'll give it a name. I'm not littering because it's all local to this, and also I think it makes it much more easier to read, right? Like this. When you start having all these nested functions within nested functions, it's just very, very hard. It's very error-prone. Okay. Instead, even though we don't need this function anywhere else, anyways, it's easier to read, right? If it's easier to understand, that has its own value. Make sense? Everyone okay? All right. So this configuration function is going to be invoked when the application is starting to boot, right? It's loading all its everything that it needs to get to run, and part of the bootstrapping is that it calls all the configurators, right? It says, okay, are there any configurations that I need to do before we start running, right? So anything I do here, right, is not going to be accessible once we are running, right? Or I'm sorry, let me change that again. Let me switch that. Once those things that I'm going to do when I'm running, all the events that I'm going to handle, all the templates, that doesn't exist yet, right? None of the template exists. None of the data exists yet. I'm not there yet. I'm not even looking at templates yet, right? I am just configuring. I don't have access to any of that yet, okay? This is just configuration. This happens before anything else. And the way the configuration works is that you at this function you ask here as a parameter to this function, what is it that you want to configure, okay? The framework will pass it to you, will inject it into this function call. What is it that you want to ask? What do we want to configure? We want to configure the routing. Okay, that's one of the things we want to configure. And the naming convention is that all these configurators, they start with the name of the feature that you want to configure, and then they all end in provider. Okay. So what we want to configure is the route provider. I think it's route provider or routing provider. I can never remember. That's what we want to configure, right? And notice that this might be a little bit confusing, right? That I'm just declaring this variable here, and magically it's being passed to me. Okay, and that's going to happen quite a lot in Angular, right? What Angular has done is that they've copied an idea that has been around for quite a while on the server side, right? Which we refer to as injection or inversion of control, right? They have a limited version of it. It's not the full-blown inversion of control as we know it on server side. So I don't know that we could even call it that. But one of the features here is that a certain service is made available by name, and if you name it, if you name that service that you want, that instance, using that specific name, right? It will magically, the infrastructure will magically instantiate it and pass it to you, either bound to a variable or passed in as an argument. Okay. And this is the case. This is one of those special magical variables, right? Notice that it starts with a $, right? Just like $scope, right? $scope was one of those magical variables that the infrastructure instantiates, right? And just passes it to you, right? So that you can use it right away. So if it starts with $, it typically is a variable that is managed by the infrastructure. We can create our own providers, right, and ask them for here, right, if we want to do our own configuration. But right now we're going to use this route provider right here. Okay, much more later on inversion of control and injection. So let's grab this provider, and one of the things that we can configure is that if we see certain URL patterns on the browser, we want to be able to load certain templates, right? We want to load the login template or the register template or whatever, right? And we want to inject it, and we want to make it appear here in the index page, somewhere in the index page, right? So we're going to configure it will say that if you see login, when you see login, then what we'll like to be able to see is that I want you to load the template URL and give it the location of the template, starting of where config is, right? So for instance, login is inside of the user directory. So there it is, login. So let's put it here, login.html. Oh, where? It's under user. So it's user/login.html. Okay. Where do I want that to appear? I want it to appear in the index page, right? To tell it where, right, where to appear, we're going to use another Angular attribute declared by our router. The router library declare this this route provider, right? This is declared by the route provider. It's not part of the core Angular module library. It's one of those things that come by having loaded the ng route, right? It creates that provider, right? That allows us to configure the routing, right? And that's how you use it in the configuration when the application is booting. And then you use yet another attribute here. You say that this is where I want it to display. This is going to be the view. This is where all the templates, all these views are going to be injected dynamically. Notice that it's empty. There's nothing in it, right? If I visit index page, notice that it's empty. There's nothing in it. Okay, and that's because the config is going to tell me how to do that, right? The config is going to tell me if you see login, this is what you should see, right? All right, so we declared our config file. Let's load it into our index page. There it is. Let's load it right here, script. And it'll be the source. We'll load the config file. Okay. And when we refresh, it loads, nothing still happens. But if we ask for /login, notice that we have the login page, right? The login page has been loaded dynamically, injected into that div, right? As far as the browser is concerned, it only loaded ngview. So this is the file that the browser downloaded from the server. There's no content in there, right? See that? So from the browsers, the browser went out and downloaded index page, and there's no forms in there. There's no login in there. Instead, it made a query. It made a query. It went back to the server, right, looking for user login.html. That's what config. This is what this config says. You saw #login on the URL. Go fetch user/login. Right, there it is. It went out under the cover. Right, we never explicitly loaded it. Right, the underlying infrastructure, the routing mechanism, goes and fetches the login template. Okay. And injects it as part of the DOM. If I look at the templates, if I look at the elements, and you see the ngview, there it is. See that? As far as the browser is concerned, that used to be empty, right? But the underlying config and the routing mechanism has injected all the HTML in there, even the links, the meta, the title, which shouldn't be there, right? Right? notice we have those links already in the head, right? We don't need them again, right? And nobody told the login page that you are now a snippet, not a full-blown HTML page. Okay, so let's do that. Let's go to the login page and remove all this extra stuff that I already have. I already have that the index page already loads these things, right? So if I refresh, it looks exactly the same, right? And our div only contains the div for the login page, this div right here. See that? It was dynamically injected and added to the DOM dynamically. Everybody okay? Right? Same thing for the other pages, right? We can go in and do a couple more. We can say that if I see register, then I should go fetch register.html. Okay? So if I go here and refresh my page and then type here register, I would see the register page. Oops. Everybody okay? All right. Again, we have the same problem, right? This is also loading all those links, right? Because nobody told the register page that this is now a single page application. So let's do that. Let's go to the register page and remove all the extraneous, right? And now this is only a snippet, right? It's not a full-blown page. Everybody okay? Right. So let's do one more, just to practice. We'll do profile, and let's reload. If we go to profile, there it is. We're in profile. Everybody good? All right. Oh yes, we did. We never told profile that they are now a snippet. Let's do that. Let's remove this additional code. We don't need it anymore. So this profile with the correct styling. All right. All right. So notice that the back button works just fine. I can go backwards and forwards. Right. That works fine. Yes.
Can you describe one more time the dependency of config.js on app.js? Is there one?
Yes, there is. So the first app.js loads, right, and it loads all the additional Angular attributes, all the additional providers, all the additional services, right, which we'll be using a little later, right? They load them into the scope of the web app maker namespace, right? So that later on in config, you know, once I load the web app maker namespace, right, it includes now all the services, providers that came along with any dependencies that were loaded into the web app maker namespace, including route provider, right? If I don't declare this, right, this would give me an error saying I don't know what route provider is. Okay. All right. Yes.
Two questions.
Yep.
First one is why can't we do the same thing directly in the app.js?
Certainly. Yeah, exactly. App.js, this is going to grow a little later. We're going to put things here that are, you know, high level, like declaration of filters or maybe directives or any dependencies might go here, right? Anything that has to do with the loading of other modules or dependencies would go here, right? Configurations, even though we have just one configuration file, more typically you might have a couple more configuration files, right? Each one per per set of features. If our website feature would include a dozen pages with their own controllers and whatnot, you would probably have a configuration file only for the website, right, side feature, right? So yeah, so typically you have them all separately.
And the second question is, before you removed all those bootstrap styles in profile.html,
Yeah.
The header and footer were different. And
Right.
the moment you removed it, it became
Right. Yeah, because there were two CSSs that were competing, right?
Yeah, but the latest one should be the one that should be shown, right?
Yes. Yep.
So shown, but it didn't show the latest one. It showed the topmost one before you removed it.
Right. There was also there might be a timing, right? Which one gets loaded first, right? And sometimes you see if a server is too slow to load a style sheet, and there might be some reinterpretation of what the styles might be. Ideally, they would be loaded, in the order in which they were meant to be loaded, right? So you might have some race conditions there as well. Yep. All right, so we have this. Notice that in the login page, if I click on login, right, notice that it's still trying to use the old way of navigation, right? All these hyperlinks are using still the old way of navigating, right? They all have hard-coded links. Yes. So we have to update these to use this new navigation mechanism, right? So let's go into the login page. Let's go into the login page and refresh this. So instead of when we click on, let's see, login, right? We want to navigate to the profile page, right? So we're going to go hash profile, meaning we are in the same page. We're only navigating to another section of the page, right? And who's going to listen for that? It's going to our config file that we configure, right? It's going to be listening for changes in the hashtag, and we're going to navigate to the profile. Let's try. Let's see if we reload, and I hover over my login page. Notice that. Oops. Uh-oh. Did I break something? Uh-oh. Ah! Oh my goodness. My server's slow. If I hover over the login page, you'll notice that it says profile, hash profile, right? So that if I click on it, then I navigate to the profile page. You have a question? Hello? You have a question? All right, keep it down, please. Notice that it navigates. Notice that it behaves as we would expect, right? Registration, that's still broken, right? So let's fix that. So this be hash register. So that if we refresh this and we navigate and click on register, it navigates fine, right? Same thing for the profile, right? If I click on register, it's not going to the profile page. So let's fix that real quick. So this registering should go to the hash profile, and this should go back to login, right? Who else? Let's see, profile. We have any hard-coded links here? We have one here, one that we can fix right away. We can go back to the login page. Okay. So if we refresh, let's see if this works. If we cancel, go to login, register. So that works. Login goes to profile. I can go back and go to register, and register goes back to profile. So all that works. So these three files are working fine, right? Up to the point where I realized that I forgot to do the naming convention, right? And we never moved this into the view directory, right? So we want those points, so we want to make sure that we follow some of those structures. For instance, we might want to rename this, and it says, oh yes, we need to rename these things. So let's refactor this. Now, typically this would be a nightmare because, hey, who's referring to the login page? There might be many pages referring to the login page. If I change the name of this file, right, and I don't have an automated way to, follow all the places that would be affected. Typically, all IDEs today, find all these dependencies and rename things, across a website. But say I don't have that, this would cause a big a maintenance nightmare, right? So this should be login view.client, right? And this should be called profile view.client, and this should be called rename, and this should be view.client. Okay. But because config is now my single point of maintenance, I don't have to go all over the place, right, and search for my broken links, right, that are not there. Obviously, they are broken, right? If I refresh, notice that register is trying to load what? Register.view.client, right? But it actually has a stale version of the template, right? It actually this should say view.client, right? And But instead of having to go fetch all my broken links, I have a single place of maintenance, right? Just this configuration file. I could even have like a graphical user interface, right, that allows me to quickly update this as a JSON object, right? So if I go back to register and I do cancel, look, everything works just fine, right? With that one single point of maintenance. Make sense? So much better for decoupling all these dependencies between these files. And you'll hear me say this quite often. Decoupling dependencies, removing these dependencies, or making very explicit what your dependencies are, right? And not just here in the aspect of navigation, but in services, web services, and model, splitting it up into tiers, right? And providing very well-defined APIs. All right, so let's keep going. Websites that's still not working, right? So let's navigate to the website, right? So let's fix that. Perhaps websites. Okay, and that would go where? Would go something like website / website list, right? Yeah, so this would be website list view view client, right? So the name of this would be something like website list.view.client. Okay, and let's see if that works. Let's in the profile, let's change that link, right? So that instead of this, it'll say just #/websites. Okay. So if I refresh and I click on websites, it navigates to the websites, right? And notice that it's not a single page application, so let's fix that. So here in websites, let's remove this at the top. And there it is, websites. We can navigate back to the profile and back. Make sense? All right. Okay, so this is the part. All this covered how to implement routing and navigation in single page applications, right? Notice, let's look at the network. What's doing, right? So if I refresh, it's a brand new page. Let's look at the network. Okay, let's clear this. So if I navigate to register, notice that indeed the client Angular, the config file, right? It's configured to go fetch that template and load it and display it. Okay. If I go back, if I cancel to a login page, notice that it shows me the login page, but notice that it didn't go fetch the login page. See that? It fetched it the very first time, and when it ran the login page. So I didn't have to go back to the server to fetch this. I already have it cached, right, on the Angular side, right? So if I click on register again, notice that I'm not going a second time to the server to fetch the register, right? All that has been compiled, right, into a DOM, a reusable DOM object that can be injected at any time, right? So Angular keeps track of all these caches, right, without having to go back to the server. So again, another aspect of single page applications, right? So all these things are cached. Yes?
If you hard reload, you're saying that every template that you...
No, then you lose all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not that it fetches all the templates.
No, only on demand. Yep, on demand. The templates are fetched on demand. The JavaScript are downloaded, which is unfortunate. But typically you would use other libraries such as require.js or things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. You'll notice that you can see the source. All the files that were downloaded, app.js, config.js, well, obviously those we do need, right? But we're going to start adding a whole bunch of controllers, right? And services and whatnot here, right? All those are going to be pre-fetched, right? Downloaded, even if we don't need them, right? Unlike the templates, right? The templates, we only load them on demand. We want when we actually navigate, right? So ideally, controllers would behave the same, right? When we go to a page, then the controller is downloaded, not prefetched here as a script tag, right? But that is not natively supported. We need library, other types of libraries such as require.js is a very popular dependency library, right? That allows you to load only what you need when you need it, right? As opposed to loading all this code that you don't need. Yes.
If you go to a new tab, then does it download again, or does it use from the
A new.
tab?
Oh no, there's no communication between the tabs. Yeah, the scope, the session for the Angular instance is per tab. Yeah. And again, when I refresh, everything is re-downloaded, right? Everything is now. Single page applications typically can run days, hours, days without ever refreshing the page, right? And obviously, depending on the browser that you're using, that browser can, over time, ask for more and more resources from your local desktop, right? And some browsers are known to, keep asking for more and more memory, i.e., that would just take up your machines, and it's just doesn't just becomes a crawl, right? And applications too, Angular single page applications, they're manipulating all these instances of objects that are being created and destroyed and added and removed from arrays and whatnot. And we, these single page applications, because we're long running, right, in a single page instance, right, we have to be careful, when we instantiate objects, and we clean up after ourselves, right, and clean up when we don't need things. And oftentimes, single page application developers would wish that once in a while you would refresh the page, right, and just start from fresh. Just empty out, any objects, instances that I might be hanging around there that are bogging down the performance of the application, right? But single page applications need to be a little more careful, right, because we're not refreshing over and over. All right, but notice that even if we refresh, right, notice that the state of the application is fully encoded, right, in this URL. Right, I should be able to copy this URL, send it to you. You should be able to click on it and see exactly the same page that I'm looking at, right? And that's not trivial, right? That's not trivial. Imagine many of these dynamic pages. So you go to Amazon, right? And their pages are fairly complex, right? Not only you have the product, you have reviews, and you have products that are similar to this, and what have other people purchased, and tons of other stuff. All that is dynamically generated, right? And all that is from that URL. I should be able to copy that URL, send it over to you. Hey, check out this product. You click on it, you should be able to see more or less the same thing. Now, if this were a static page, well, obviously you would see the same thing. But these are not static pages. These are all dynamic pages, right? And the only way to know that we're looking at the same thing is that the URL uniquely captures everything I need to be able to recreate that page that you're looking from different places. That make sense? And it's dynamic. If I come tomorrow to the same page, the price might have gone down, right? It's out of stock, right? Or the reviews might have changed, right? So it's dynamic. From time to time, it'll change. But nevertheless, the URL should always be uniquely identify the state of the application. Somebody had a question? Yes. It'll clean it, right? All the data that you're instantiating or loading, right? They're going against the RAM of the browser, right? So when the browser dies, all that is released, right? And you're only ever going to be looking at a snippet of the overall data, right? So if it's lots of products, you're only ever going to look at a subset of all the products, right? So you're never actually going to have access to everything that is on the server, right, on a database.
Whatever we browse and whatever we access, will be stored somewhere so that next time when we load the same page to make it faster,
No, you would have to, the URL would encode all the state that you need, and a query would go out to the server and say, hey server, this is the state of the application. I want to recreate the state of the application. The server would provide, would do all the queries and whatnot, right? Aggregate the data, pass it to us as a JSON file, and the parts that are dynamic would be re-rendered dynamically again. There are some caching mechanisms that you might want to try. There's local storage that you could store a couple of things. There's a local, a mini database that browsers can but typically no. The server is the only one who can really tell you what the state of that page should be, right? Also because any data that this client might have is always going to be stale compared to what the server might have, right? The server is going to be our source of truth, right? The client is always going to be slightly behind whatever the server says, right? You're trying to book a plane, and you show me that there's 5 seats available. I'm going to click on it. While I think about it, oh well, do I want an aisle? Do I want this and that? When I click it, it's gone. So wait a minute, but it was. So you're always behind, right? The server is really the one who tells you the truth, right? And obviously there's always some techniques that you need to be able to reconcile, right, with stale data that you might be displaying at the client, and reconcile it with the truth of whatever the actual server says, right? Also considering transactions and whatnot, long-running transactions, things like that. That's other things you need to consider, right? I was going somewhere. Right, controllers. Right. So right now we've been looking at navigating between these various pages, right, using this new routing mechanism, right? So let's now start talking about controllers. Each one of these pages is going to have a dedicated controller, right? So let's start off at the beginning, at the login page, right? So for the login page, right, we're going to declare a controller for the login page in a dedicated controller. It'll be something like login.controller.view.js. Again, oh, sorry, client. Refactor client. Okay. Notice again, client places us that all of this code, the template is being rendered by the client, by the browser. This controller is being executed, it's JavaScript. It's being executed on the browser, and it's a controller. So the controller kind of tells us that this is, the role of this is to interpret user feed input, right? Manipulate some model data, right, through perhaps a service, and then provide the results to the view for rendering, right? So we understand what the role of this is, and typically we want to make sure that each file has a single role, right? That you don't have files that have multiple roles, and the complexity might get out of hand, right? So let's create this first controller. Again, an IFI inside of an IFI. We're going to read that same Angular module we've been working on, which is the web app maker. And we're going to declare a single controller, right? Called login controller. I think that's what we called it, login controller. And we're going to implement it. Oops. We're going to implement it in a function of the same name. Okay. I call them the same names just to keep it straight in my head. Right. It's a nice convention. A better name might be a lowercase controller. So this is a function. Here there's a controller. And typically we would have the scope here, right? But remember, we're not going to use scope anymore, right? Remember what controllers do, right? They bind data back and forth. There's two-way binding between the view template, right, and the logic here, okay? And typically the binding is through the scope, right? But we're not going to use scope anymore. Okay, so here's the declaration of that login controller, and let's do a console log just to make sure that we are entering here. There it is. And we're going to load that into our index page. We just declared it. Let's load it in our index page. Where is my index page? There it is. Let's load it here. Script source equal, source, and that's under user slash, what is it? Login controller. There it is, login controller. So there it is. We loaded it. Notice that if I reload, my console is not displaying that hello world, right? That login controller. It's because even though the file is loaded, it wasn't bound to a view, right? This view would load a particular controller. We need to tell the view, we need to tell the configuration which view we should load, which controller we should load for this particular view. All right, so let's do that. We're going to tell the view, the config, that when I load that login template, we also want to load the following controller, which is now known across the infrastructure as the login controller by name, right? Which we declared it right here. That's the name. We declared it, right? And that's how it can be referred by name everywhere else. Okay, so there it is. So now that we load this, notice that it says login controller, right? So together, the template is being fetched from the server. It's being rendered, and also the login controller is being instantiated, right? And once it gets instantiated, it executes, right? Whatever is here, it executes, right? This is being used as a constructor, right? This controller creates an instance of that controller, and it binds it to the view as configured here. Everybody good? All right. You could still use the scope like we normally would, right? Like you would normally expect. We could say scope hello. We could say hello from login controller, right? And the template, the associated template, which is the login template, we can refer to things that are declared on the scope. So from here, we could say hello, right? We could say hello. I'm going to do a break here. So if we load, notice that we have here hello from login controller. So these two guys are talking to one another, right? The login controller can send data to the view. The view can send username and password and clicks back to the controller through the scope like we talked about a couple weeks ago, right? But we're not going to do that. We're not going to use scope, right? We're going to complicate things just a slightly bit, just a little bit, not too much. Okay. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to declare locally a variable. And we're going to bind the instance of the controller. We're going to bind it to that variable. Only because model is a nicer name than this, right? And also it gives it a meaning, right? The meaning of this variable is that it's going to hold the data that is going to be the model, right, of the data that is going to be sent over to the view for rendering, and vice versa. The view is going to manipulate the model, the data that is in the page, and send it over to me through the model. Now, model is a little bit misleading because when we talk about model, we actually are thinking more downstream. You know, it's like more closer to the database, right? That is typically, classically, that's what we talk about when we talk about model, right? Here it's a little model. No, it's not big capital model. It's lowercase model, right? So oftentimes instead of using the word model, which could be misinterpreted as the model in the database, right, or the model in the model tier of an MVC, we use a smaller version of this. We call it VM, as view model, right? You can use the whole full name, view model, or the acronym VM, right? So now it's clear that this is not that model, capital model, right? This is a subset of that model that is only meant for display. Okay, it's not meant for manipulating any data in the back end. Yes?
And in this context, this is your controller instance?
This is a controller instance, yes.
Okay, this.
Yeah, this is this. It's this instance for the. So this is being treated as a constructor, right? And this allows you to refer to the current instance of that object that is being created. Yep. So I still want to be able to send stuff back and forth. So how do we do that? So the way we do that is that we instead of binding it to the scope, we're now going to bind things to the controller instance. So we're going to say VM hello instead of scope hello. Right? So this can still say hello again from login controller. Okay? So for this to work, right, the view doesn't know anything about this of that controller. It knows that it's associated to some controller, right? It knows that, but since it's not using scope, it says, what am I going to use then? Right? What am I going to use to refer to that controller? So to support this design pattern, Angular adds the following: controller as, meaning you can refer to this instance by the following name, whatever you can want to call it, right? We can say the login model, the login page model, right? Or just model. Okay, that means that now from within the template, I'm going to be able to refer to this controller by the name that I give it here. So within the template, right, I can now refer to the instance of the controller by the name I gave it in the controller as. So anything I put in the controller instance is now available through this model variable. You can say model.hello. Okay? So if I refresh, there it is. Hello again from login controller. Yes?
Did you say that model is a good name? Or
No, so VM. Let's use VM, right? So VM. And here, I didn't want to use the same exact variable from here, from the controller.
That would be referring to controller object by the name model, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Seems confusing.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Say again.
If you had named it model,
Yeah.
then you would be referring to a controller object
As
using the
model,
name model.
right? Yes. So basically, I'm using the instance of the controller as a placeholder, right, to bind data that I want to pass over to the view, right? So it's going to hold the model,
Yeah.
lowercase model,
Okay.
that I'm passing that is only for consumption for rendering the page, right?
Okay.
Right. So from the views controller, it is the model. It's holding the data. However, however that bucket is being filled, right? It's being filled by an instance of the controller. Okay. So yes.
If you use components, so there's a thing with the direct with the components.
Yep.
If you use components, for example, then it'll automatically default controller as $TRL. So that's like
Okay.
the default.
Yeah.
And
Default name.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. It is common to use model as the name for this, right? So I am going to use model here. It's very common. You'll see that quite a bit. Right? So there it is. So there's the data that is coming. Now the data here is bound, as opposed to being bound to the scope, which can inherit from higher scopes, right? This over here, now my hello variable is scoped, right, to this particular instance of the controller, right? There's no misinterpretation. Who is giving me this data, right? If there are several controllers on the page, right, there is no ambiguity, right, that it is this controller that is giving me this variable, right? If I should have several controllers on the page, or maybe controllers that are nested one inside of another, right? If we use just a plain scope, then it is ambiguous. Who is giving me this hello world? Who's declaring this variable? Is it the controller for this login page, or a higher level controller, maybe a nav controller, or maybe an even higher main controller, right? And so you would have problems of variables perhaps being declare on top of each other, right? And so it's not clear who's giving me the data, right? And the whole point is to, minimize the scope of things, right? That's why we don't use gotos, right? That's why we don't use global variables. Always we want to manage, right, our context. We want to explicitly know where is this data coming from, right? We don't want things overlapping. So this makes it very, very explicit that the hello variable is a scoped variable and is bound to this particular scope. That makes sense? Right? And you can have separate scope and you explicitly know which scope are you talking about. All right? All right. Great. Okay. Perhaps one more thing. Let me leave that there. Another design pattern that I'm going to introduce here is that any logic that should occur right when the controller first is instantiated, right? Things that should happen every time that the controller loads without user intervention, right? Notice that this variable was loaded right when the controller is instantiated. Yes? There are certain things that we want to happen always when the controller is loaded. For instance, if you go to an edit page. If you go to an edit page, by default, the fields are all empty, right? But it's an edit page. It's supposed to be editing something that exists. It makes no sense that the fields would be empty, right? So the controller, what should do? It should say, okay, what's the ID of the thing that I am editing? Let me go fetch that on the server from a database, right? I fetched it, and now I pass it to the view for rendering, and the view renders it. Make sense? And that should happen every time I load that page, right? Initialize the content. Go fetch whatever I need. Or in widget list or website list, what should happen? By default, it's just empty. There are no pages, right? Because the entry repeat is not yet bound to anything, right? What should happen? It should go out to the server and say, hey, give me all the websites. It comes back with an array, passes it to the view, and the view iterates and renders all the websites. Yes? So that going to fetch things from the database, that's something that should happen every time the controller loads. Yes? Right? So this is an example of something that is happening all the time. I am always binding the hello variable. Right? So a common design pattern is to encapsulate anything that should happen always when this loads, encapsulate in a function. Encapsulate in a function, right? And then put that in there, right? And then explicitly call it. Explicitly call it. Now you know that you explicitly want this to happen, right? As opposed to, oh, it just happened because it's outside of any scope, right? You are controlling that, and now it's tagged that this is what should happen to initialize this controller, right? It's very little, right? But it makes it very, very explicit that you are taking control of what happens when this is initialized, right? It doesn't have to be called init, but it's a very common name, right? Whatever you call it, don't forget to actually call it, all right? Otherwise, it won't actually initialize. Yes? I'm sorry? In the form of iffy. Like in here? Right, but you mean out here, you mean?
No, but instead of writing init explicitly, and we write right after function. I think he's just talking about renaming the function name.
Otherwise, if you wrap that in an if, then the rest.
Oh!
Yeah, I'm saying like whatever is left side of that bracket should be executed, right?
Left of what bracket?
Right below that cursor, you have written init, right?
Yeah.
If I omit that init,
Yep.
and write onto the bracket.
Oh, that you mean like to put a function here, and then put this in here?
No.
Ah! I'm sorry.
On line 11.
Yes.
Yeah, just open parentheses.
Oh, okay, so something like that?
Yeah.
That's not.
Like that? Is that what you're saying? Actually, that would do it. Now, anything that is declared in here, right, would only exist in that namespace, right? And then it would just disappear once the function gets called, right? So we do want whatever is declared here to be in a higher scope up here, right? So anything, any local variables that you would declare here would be gone after the function gets invoked, right? Although this VM hello does have a higher scope. Actually, I've never seen this like that. Maybe it works. I don't know. Try it out. You were saying, I'm sorry?
No, I was saying
Yeah, we isolate the scope. Yeah. Here, now remember, the point of iffy, right, was to create an encapsulation, right, that is not competing in the global space, right, in the global variable space. Here we don't have that intention of creating something that is encapsulated, right? We're already encapsulated, right? This pattern is sometimes referred to as a module. Typically in a module you would have some kind of like return of some kind of mapping object, right, that could be used outside. We're going to use the module design pattern a little later. Where was I? Okay, so this should work exactly the same way. So this is still working. There it is, that init. I don't have anything in particular that I want it to happen in the login page, login control, so I'm just going to leave it empty, right? And I know that I am deliberately not doing anything in that init function, right? And I know that I'm doing that. All right, so what do I want to do? Let's see. When I click on the login page, I don't want to blindly navigate to the profile page, right? I want to actually notify the controller that the user has invoked this button, okay? So let's do that. Let's, instead of having an href, we want to notify the controller, right? And the way we do that is by doing an ng-click, right? And the ng-click, we want to notify the controller through some event handler, right? We need some event handler over here. So we like to do something like model. Remember that this is the way we refer to anything that is bound to the instance of the controller. And we would like to say maybe something like login. Right? Right now, the login doesn't do anything, right? The controller doesn't have a login declared on it, right? So let's do that. Let's declare a login event handler. Right? So to do that, we're going to bind it to the VM, login, there it is, right? And bind it to a function. And we're going to say console log login. Button clicked. Okay? If we refresh and we click on the login, notice that indeed we are invoking that function. Right? So here's another design pattern I'm introducing. Instead of declaring these functions like this, right? These are referred to as event handlers, meaning they're handling events that are occurring on the view, right? And you can have any number of these, right? And each one of these event handlers might have several lines of code, right? It can be fairly complex, okay? So you might have declare one event handler here, and a couple lines later, 20 lines later, you might have another event handler declare, and then another 10 lines later, another event handler, right? It would be very hard to read all the event handlers, right? So instead, what I'm going to ask you to do instead is to declare all these functions, right, by name, and bind them at the top. It says that .login maps to this function that is declared way at the bottom. Okay? It does exactly the same thing, right? It clicks and it handles that event, but now it's so much easier to read, right? You can have any number of event handlers declared at the top, perhaps with some event handlers, right? And you declare all your event handlers. Now it becomes very easy for somebody to open up your file and see, oh, you have these 4 event handlers. I can immediately visually identify that these are the events that you're handling. If I care to know how they're implemented, I can scroll and actually read the implementation. But you're not forcing me to read it, right? you're not forcing me to read it to find out how many event handlers does this page handle. Okay? Again, a best practice design patterns to follow, right? And those are things that you'll be graded on the assignment, right? That I'll be asking not to use scope. I'll be asking to declare all the event handlers at the top, right? To have init functions, implement all the event handlers at the bottom, right? All those things are going to be part of the rubric, right? And you're going to be graded on that. Okay, make sense? Everybody okay? Yes.
Why is it not in the initial function?
So init is any logic that you want to run, right? When this first loads, when the controller is instantiated, do whatever, right? In this case, I don't want to do anything when I load, right? When I load, there's nothing for me to do, right? In the login, so it's empty. Logging, I want it to happen only when I click, right? Only when I click. So this function, notice that it's not invoked unless somebody clicks it. Somebody clicks the button. So this is invoked all the time. In this case, I have nothing to do. I would almost be tempted to just remove it, okay, because it's empty. I'm going to leave it so that it is deliberate that I know that I am not doing anything in the login page, right? There's nothing for me to do. Whereas the login is an event handler, as this says, is an event handler, and will only be invoked when the button is clicked over here. Make sense, the distinction?
Yeah, the event handler defining
Right, it's bound because I want the view to be able to call this. The init is not being invoked by the view, right? The init is I am invoking it myself as I load, right? As this is being instantiated. The view doesn't even know anything yet, right? Even before the view loads, I want this to execute, right? So I can go fetch data, I can go do something to the database, come back. Now I have the data, and I can now pass it along to the view, right? So I can be ready for when the view is ready, right? Yes?
Give an example as to what should be loaded.
In the init?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, for instance, in an edit page, right? In the edit page, I would like to be able to show something on the form for me to edit, right? Or the website list, right? I want to be able to list the website. So in the init function, I would use a service to go fetch the name of the page or whatever so I can populate the editor. Or I would fetch the list of websites so I can then pass it to the view for display and iterate over. Yes, I would do it in the init. Okay, it will do that in a minute. Yeah, maybe. Okay, everybody okay? Everybody still with me? All right. All right, so the login should take as argument some object-oriented representation of the user that is trying to log in. Yes? So presumably I'm going to pass in a user object from the view. The view should pass me this. So let's go back to the view, and we like to pass in a user object, right, that has the scope of this current page, right? This page wants to declare a couple of things. So let's do that. So this input field should hold the username of that user, and this input field should hold the password of that user object, right? And we know how to do that, right? We can use the ng model to declare, to bind this field with a local object called user and username, right? So that binds this input field to this local little model, tiny little model of a user object, and this is the password. Okay, and the user object will be passed along to the login function. This user object is declared where? On the scope, right? On the scope of this page. It would be available to the controller if we would be using the $ scope. Yes, but we're not. Right, we're not using the $ scope. So this user is not available to the controller unless I would be using the $ scope. If instead I would be putting model.user, then that totally is available to the controller through the VM variable, right? But we're not going to do that. Again, we're going to try and keep the scopes as small as possible. This user object only exists in this page, right? And I'm only passing it to the controller through a parameter, through a function. Again, we're trying to be as object-oriented as possible, right? Trying to avoid any uses of side effects, right? The $ scope object is it's like a side effect, right? Oh, I have it because there's a $ scope side effect. Instead, here I am deliberately passing it to you. That's such a better design, right? Through methods and invocations and messages. All right, so I have the user object. If I reload and do a source, and I put a breakpoint there on the login controller, there's the login controller. I put a breakpoint. If I pass data and I click on login, notice that there we are, right? We can see exactly the object that's being passed. We can hover it. There's the username and password being passed to us, right? And then we can do whatever we need to do, right? A question?
Are there security implications about using, for example, $ scope inside of your view?
No, no.
Okay.
No. When you're here on the client, everything's public, and you can see everything, right? Unless perhaps the code is obfuscated, which typically they are. They're minimized and obfuscated so that you can look at the code, but it makes absolutely no sense to you, right? You can't even step through the code, right? Still, the network connections are still live, so they're plain text. Typically, the code, the data going back and forth between the client and the server. If it's compromising data or private data, typically you would go through an SSL, so that even if you're looking at the data, it's encrypted, right? But everything else typically is just plain text going back and forth, right? It's available. All right. Okay, so let's keep going. What do we want to do with this login, with this user? We would like to be able to see if this user exists, right? So where do we check to see if this user exists? We would need to use some data holder, somebody who is responsible for holding this data, right? So to do that, we're going to start using what is called a service, right? What we mentioned earlier, right? We're going to encapsulate all the data through a service, right? If you want data, you have to go through the service, right? It's not just going to be available anywhere. You have to go through the service through a very well-defined API, right? So let's do that. Let's declare our very first service. Let's declare here a services directory, and under here we'll create our very first service, right? And it's going to be the user.service.client.js, right? And here let's declare our service using Angular on that same module that we've been working on, right, which is called Web App Maker, right? And we're going to use a factory to declare our service. We're going to call it user service. Implement it in a constructor of the same name, perhaps underscore. Okay? Everybody good? So here is where I'm going to, for now, I'm going to host the data here. Eventually, this data is going to move onto the server, right? And eventually it's going to move down to the database, right? And we gave you some dummy data in the assignment for the users somewhere. There it is, right? Which we're going to declare here as users in that array. Okay? And what we want to do is provide a nice, clean, consistent API that would allow us to do all the CRUD operations on this data, on the data that we're hosting here, right? So we're going to declare an API here as a map, as a JSON map, right? That has functions such as find user by credentials, right? Implemented in a function of the same name, right? And we're going to return this API. So what's going to happen here is that the framework is going to create an instance of this, right? And that instance is going to be bound to whatever we return. See, it's going to call this function, right? And what does this function return? It returns this object right here. You see that? It returns that object. So if I ever use that user service instance, that instance is going to be what? This object, this API object. That API object has attributes which are bound to a local function declared down here. So that I should be able to use the user instance dot, right, the attribute find user by credentials, and what would I get? I would get this function, right? And I should be able to pass it username and password, and the find user by credential should be able to iterate over this array and tell me if that user exists, right? Okay, so this will look something like, iterate over user, and if user sub u dot username is equal to username, and user sub u dot password is equal to password, then I found my user. And I'm going to return the user. Otherwise, I'll return null. Make sense? Something like that. Just a couple things here. Now notice the syntax here. Var u in user. Okay. If this were Java, u would be bound to the instances, right? Each one of these instances. I'm sorry? Oh, thank you. Yes, users. Yes, thank you. Right, if this were Java or maybe .NET, the u here, the variable u here, would be bound to each instance of users as you iterate, right? Unfortunately, in JavaScript, that's not the case. U is just an index, right? Which it's just 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Unfortunately, so here we're using it as an index, right? So I'm referring to the first user, the second, the third, the fourth, and so on and so forth. Yes. Also, I'm checking to see, and when I do find it, I return the user. Otherwise, I return null. Right. So great. So I have this user service. Let's load it from our index page. Yes. Return. Oh, thank you. User sub u, right? User sub u. Yeah, that user. Thank you. Yep. Okay, you're still awake. Awesome. So let's load this into the index page. Right, let's load it into the index page. So the service, let's load that service script, and it's where is it? It's in, I think it's services, and then there's a user service, right? That's it. You load it. So now we know that service. So now we want to use that service, right? And the way we use it is by using the magic of injection. Okay. We just magically name it here using the same exact name by which we named it here. By declaring it here with quote unquote, right? We are telling the Angular framework, right, that this singleton, this single instance, this API right here, object, I want to be able to refer to it anywhere, right, by name, and the Angular framework is going to, in this controller right here, this controller, what it does is that it parses that function. It parses the underlying guts of this. It parses your function, and it looks at the parameters of that function. And it sees, oh, you want a user service. Okay, yeah, I know, somebody declared that. So it makes a note of that. So whenever it's going to invoke login controller, it'll pass that instance that you asked for here. Okay, and this will still work if all of a sudden I decide to go rogue and it says, oh, I want to use scope. this will still work. User service will still be invoked, even though, right? Even though I just added a parameter in front of it, right? Or I put the parameter afterwards. Parameter order doesn't matter, right? What matters is the name, right? So that's one of the things that Angular calls it, injection, inversion of control. But it's not quite inversion of control. In inversion of control, I should be able to decide what I want to inject on the fly. Here you can't, right? You are committed to be injected only this one service, right? Injection of control, you should be able to control that too. We don't have that in Angular, so it's not true inversion of control. Yes?
The user service getting globally said that we have a user service out here.
Yes.
Now, imagine we want everything to be controlled within a folder, like folder specific.
Okay.
Since we have a router which is common to all the folders,
Yes.
and that index HTML is loading all the
Yep.
controllers.
Yes.
How can we differentiate? Say, I want a login
Yep.
controller within a user, and I want a login controller within a. Say,
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. That one of the problems is that we are loading all this JavaScript a priori, right? Even if we are not going to use them, right? There's going to be several dozen controllers, and if we follow a particular path in the application, we might not even touch half of them, of the controllers, right? Or the services, all these great services that we're writing. And unlike templates, templates are loaded on demand, right? We go to the server and retrieve one of those. So unfortunately, we haven't yet seen a couple of techniques to load these JavaScript only on demand, only when you need them, right? We would need a mechanism to determine, to configure dependencies, right? If you are in the login template, you need the controller and you need the user service, right? If you are in the website, you don't need those, right? You only need, excuse me, the website controllers and, well, one of them in the template you're in, and you need the website service, right? For that, there's libraries that allow you to do that. One of them is Require.js. Require.js is a library that allows you to do that. You can create dependencies and say, I am declaring a module. This module depends on these other JavaScript, right? So your script, your top-level index page is empty. You just have app, config, and that's it, right? And this other Require.js library. And Require.js library, you define it, you declare a JSON file that says, when you're here, also load these things. When you're there, also loads these other things. Very much what config is doing here, right? That's pretty much what config is doing, but it's doing it for the template, right? All these controllers are already existent. They're already declared, right? They're already loaded, right? Whereas the template, I haven't yet loaded until I actually navigate, right? Right now, the only mechanism that we have is that all these are loaded regardless, even if you don't need them. No, they're loaded, right? They're all loaded right here. The script tag, right? Invokes HTTP requests to all these servers and loads and downloads them, simultaneously, right? In parallel, right? And then loads them, and it keeps track of, what script was loaded from which domain, right? It keeps track of all those things because there are some security issues, right? Cross-browser scripting and things like that. But nevertheless, they're all loaded, right? And they're all executed. Any global variables, any global functions, any invocations will be executed, right? Right? Yeah, awesome questions. Yeah, so Require.js, if you really want to look at that, Require.js is a very, very common library that allows you to create all these dependencies. Okay. Where was I? Right. So in the controller, in the login controller now, right? I don't want my scope. Now I have access to that user service. From the login controller, I can now ask, hey, user service, find me find user by credentials, right? And I'm going to pass you a username, and I'm going to pass you a user password, okay? And presumably this is going to return to me a user, all right, or null, okay? And we're going to do a let's put a breakpoint there. Okay, so let's load that again. Load it and put a breakpoint right there. Okay, and so if I type in Bob and Bob, I think that was one of the users. We can step through this. We can step in, and we have the username is Bob, password is Bob, and we can step through this. At some point, either we break here or we break here. So we're going to do continue. Okay, it looks like it found it, right? And presumably it found it, so we're going to do a step through. Continue. And we're back here, and user is indeed Bob Marley. There it is, username, password. Okay, we found Bob Marley. He's alive. Okay, so we found it, and then we can decide to either, we were successful. What should we do? Now we should allow you to navigate to the profile page or not. Okay, so we can ask, right? If user, then we navigate and say we want to navigate to the profile page programmatically, right? What we want to do is make use of this config. How do we navigate to the profile? /profile, right? So we could do that. We can say, hey, go to /profile. To do that, we need a separate. Actually, let me just demonstrate that if I put in here location, this still works. The user server will still be passed to me, even though I just changed my signature, right? Location is a service, just like $scope is a service, that allows me to interact with this URL, right? Allows me to read it, set it, parse it, modify, manipulate it, extract parameters, create parameters, all sorts of things. Okay. So what do I want to do? I want to modify the URL and make it equal to login. What is it? Profile. Profile. Okay. What this is going to do is that it's going to modify things after the hash, right? Because it's a single page application. It knows we're in the index page, right? We don't want to leave the index page. We are ever only going to want to modify things after the hash, right? Okay, so all operations will be about everything after the hash, right? So let's do that. If I refresh and I do a Bob, it breaks, and then do a continue. There it is. It goes to the profile page. Yes? Now, this is not quite what the assignment asked us to do, right? The assignment asked us to do to map the profile, not to profile, right? I think it said to map it to user / user ID, right? I think that's what it said. Yes, right? So so that means that this actually should be user followed by the ID of the user. So it's user _ID, right? That's coming from the user object from the service. Yes, right? So if I refresh this and I go back, refresh, and I try Bob again, and I do login, notice that indeed I have user /234. See that? Right? So this profile, notice that it's empty. What should the profile do? The profile should go back to the server. Now that I have the ID of the user that I want to display, I'm going to go fetch the user from the data from the server. That'll give me all the profile information, who they're following, all the articles that they've posted on, who's following me, all sorts of things, right, that are associated to my profile, right? So the profile should do something similar, right? The profile, there should be a controller for that. There will be a controller. Oh, it's already 9 o'clock. Or actually, this is a good breaking point. This could be an else here, right? This could be an else here that says something like error, right? Might say something like vm.error user not found, something like that, right? And then on the login page, we could have an error message here, right? This something like model.error. So if we go back and refresh, if we type some garbage, right? This would say error user not found. Let's put a break. Let's put this up. We could style this a little nicer. If we go to Bootstrap, we can find some nice alert boxes in the components. If we go down to alert, there's a couple of these. So let's grab this red one, danger, and we can style that error and put the error in here, right? So if I go to a login page, I have this empty red box, right? That would give me that error user not found, but I don't want to show the error unless there is an error. So we could use ng-show. ng-show is another Angular attribute that shows this div, this DOM element, only if the expression is true, or it's truthy. Truthy, meaning not null, not false, not zero, not empty string, okay, not any of those, right? So it's truthy, okay, truthiness. So for instance, if you have model error, by default, model error, to start off, model error is undefined, right? No, there is no error, right? So it's falsy. It's falsy, right? Any of those. Undefined, zero, empty string. Right? So if we refresh this, notice that it's refreshed. Notice that it does not show unless I do some login. And then it says user not found. Make sense? All right, I'm going to leave it here. Any questions? Any more questions? All right, so the assignment is out. You have so the couple weeks to complete it. Next week we're going to be doing the quiz, right? Which will talk about controllers, right? Declaring controllers and routing and things like that. Yes, I will push this.